Mr. Vandewalker, you're now recognized for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Brennan Center for Justice, I thank the Subcommittee on Information Technology for holding this hearing. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you our recommendations concerning federal political advertisement laws and regulations, particularly as they relate to the ability of foreign powers to interfere in American elections. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan think tank and advocacy organization that focuses on democracy and justice and has studied campaign finance for 20 years, working to develop and defend effective and constitutionally sound policies. There are gaping holes in our regulation of paid political ads. In contrast to radio and television, much of the election spending on the internet is untouched by key regulations. These include the requirement to report spending on mass media ads that mention candidates in the period before an election, the ban on foreign nationals buying such ads, and the requirement that broadcasters retain public files of political ads. It's time for this to change. The internet is only going to grow in its importance to politics. The $1.4 billion spent online in 2016 was almost 8 times higher than 2012. Failure to subject ads on the internet to the same disclosure regime as other media will leave the public without key information about who is trying to influence them. And it will allow more mischief from foreign adversaries like Russia's meddling in 2016. The Honest Ads Act, introduced in the Senate by Senators Klobuchar, McCain, and Warner, and in the House by Representative Kilmer, offers a promising framework to ensure such disclosure. Congress could also close other loopholes that allow secrecy and potentially foreign money, like spending by dark money organizations and foreign-owned corporations. These steps are surely needed. Investigations into the 2016 election have revealed a widespread, multi-pronged effort by the Russian government to alter the course of public debate by injecting propaganda and divisive messages into the American political discussion. As has been mentioned, firms linked to the Kremlin bought thousands of online ads on several major platforms that were seen by millions of people. The ads have still not been released to the public, but they reportedly discussed political issues, including messages advocating the election of candidates, all while the Russians disguised their identity with fake profiles designed to look like they were controlled by Americans. The intelligence community is confident that Russia will be back, and of course we must watch for copycats like China, North Korea, and even ISIS. Most immediately, this challenge to the American people's political sovereignty and the First Amendment values of transparency in politics requires updating campaign finance laws for the internet age. Congress should include paid ads on the internet in the definition of electioneering communications from the McCain-Feingold bill, which requires disclosure of expenditures above $10,000 on ads that mention candidates in certain mass media within a specified period. This would have 2 benefits. It would expand the ban on foreign spending, and it would increase transparency around online ads, making information about who is paying for them publicly available. In addition, online platforms should be required to maintain public files of political ads. That would essentially extend to the internet the Federal Communications Commission requirement that broadcasters maintain a public file of political ads. And online platforms, along with other businesses that sell ads, should be required to make reasonable efforts to prevent political ads from being sold to foreign nationals. All of these elements are present in the Honest Ads Act. Moving beyond the internet, holes in campaign finance disclosure rules allow dark money organizations to spend on politics without revealing their donors, potentially hiding foreign sources of funds. In order to close the holes, Congress should enact the Disclose Act. Another blind spot in campaign finance results from corporations' ability to spend in elections. Congress should expand the ban on foreign election spending to domestic corporations substantially owned or controlled by foreign nationals, as Representative Raskin's Get Foreign Money Out of U.S. Elections Act would do. Finally, these proposals, as well as existing laws, need vigorous enforcement. Yet deadlocks at the FEC have increased, and it has passed up chances to strengthen regulations. Congress can reform the agency, including by making the number of commissioners odd and requiring at least 1 member to be nonpartisan. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
We're going to allow the federal government to determine what is appropriate content in social media. We're going to have them determine, well, that's a political ad, that's not. We're going to leave it up to a group of people to decide that?
Well, no. Sorry. The idea is to incorporate an existing framework that already is out there. The electioneering communications is a bright line test. It's candidate mentions within a certain time period above a certain spending threshold.
Well, let me stop you, though. Clearly, the bright line hasn't worked. As Mr. Rothenberg notes and Mr. Dickerson noted, the reality is an awful lot of these posts that are now questioned as influencing the election fell well outside the bright line. So who's going to determine that?
Well, again, the bright line keeps you from having someone have to determine it. Certainly, there are things outside of the bright line, but you know, having a bright line and having people understand that they can post if it's below a spending threshold protects speech and protects the ability of people to talk about legislative issues without having a decision maker have to make judgment calls every time.
Mr. Vandewalker, are our current laws and regulations sufficient to prevent future influence campaigns by foreign actors? If not, why not?
Well, unfortunately, too much of the internet is left out right now. We have, as I mentioned, a regime that applies to political spending in mass media, and at the time that that regime was enacted, the important mass media were covered, but now the internet is far more important than it was then, and it's only gaining in importance. And it should be brought into the regime that exists so that spending above certain spending thresholds on electioneering communications should be covered. A similar requirement to disclosures for political ads under the FCC rule for broadcasters should be applied to internet ads as well when they're paid for.
Okay.
Mr. Vandewalker, let me switch to you. You've made what seems like the intuitively obvious point that the internet is properly analogized to TV and radio in terms of the medium, in terms of its impact, in terms of how it works, and therefore the rules that apply to electioneering communications in the TV context and the broadcast context should also apply in the internet. And all of us are familiar with that. We have to say that you know, we paid for this ad and we stand by this ad and all that kind of stuff. But what about the problem, which has kind of been floating around from the beginning of the hearing, that it seems as if of the hundreds and hundreds of Facebook pages and Twitter messages and bots that were put out by the Russians, many of them were just meant to sow chaos and to inject poison into the American body politic. They would not fall within the electioneering communications definition that we've got under the McCain-Feingold legislation. Can anything be done about that, or is it, as Mr. Rothenberg is suggesting, that, well, we've learned our lesson from 2016, and now the public is going to be much more wary, or should be, and the media themselves and the internet companies themselves should try to be on top of this problem?
Right. I mean, I think, as you noted, we should close the doors that we know we can close. I don't think that's all that can be done. For example, the political ad database encompassed in the Honest Ads Act actually goes beyond electioneering communications because it involves issues of national legislative importance, and so would create a publicly available record that researchers could use to try to piece together what's coming from where, who's being targeted, and what are the messages. That could be, I think, extremely valuable in understanding what the sort of next attacks are and how to respond. And then I think there are more things to be done sort of outside the realm of campaign finance, and that's going to require industry and Congress working together in the ways that Mr. Rothenberger has proposed and really figuring out how to get on top of this thing.
Let me ask you another question. The Supreme Court in the Blumen decision upheld our traditional ban on foreign nationals spending money in U.S. elections. That's not covered by Citizens United if they are not a U.S. individual or a corporation. However, foreign money could take over domestic corporations, as you were suggesting before, and then money could be channeled through this Citizens United loophole directly into the political system. Is that something that you think we can tighten up as well?
Yes, definitely. Regulation has in many ways not caught up with Citizens United, even though it was several years ago now. Corporations' ability to spend unlimited amounts on politics, either directly or through super PACs, requires dealing with the problem that even a domestic corporation can be wholly owned or controlled by foreign powers. And that should be tightened up. One of the ways would be to as has been proposed, set some kind of percentage, or ownership percentage by foreign nationals or foreign governments, and say above this, even a domestically cited or incorporated corporation can't spend on politics.
Mr. Chairman.
Laws like the Federal Election Campaign Act, McCain-Feingold, Supreme Court cases like Citizens United, do those refer to, and should those cover all political advertisements, whether express advocacy or issue advocacy, despite the platform? Mr. Vandewalker?
Yes, I think our campaign finance regime at its heart is about transfers of money designed to influence politics. Whether that means buying a political ad, writing a check directly to a candidate, there are different ways that can play out in detail, but yes, I think
Mr. Rothenberg?
Mr. Vandewalker, you're familiar with the Honest Ads Act that my friend Mr. Kilmer and Senator McCain have put out there. Seems straightforward. Give me your opinion on that, please.
We think it's the Brennan Center takes the position that it is an excellent framework to apply to to address the problem of political spending, which to close doors on foreign spending that can come in and affect elections by bringing the internet into an established framework that exists for political spending and other mass media.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Vandewalker, given the fact that there is precedent, that's one example. There are lots of other examples of circumscribing what otherwise would be free speech. Tobacco advertising, example. The government makes a producer of a certain product actually add words to its packaging it does not want to add, but that are required by law. So there's precedent. No one wants to infringe the First Amendment, but one of our friends on the other side of the aisle earlier made it seem as if the choice were, gut the First Amendment or deal with this problem. And it seems to me those are not the only two options in front of us. Your comment?
That's right. There are sort of limits on the amount of speech in various ways, and it's important to recognize that there are First Amendment interests on both sides. That is, the listener has an interest in knowing who is speaking to them so that they can evaluate that message. The sort of democratic interests in voters knowing who's piping up for a candidate. That tells you something about what that candidate stands for. Holding candidates accountable for the financial support that they get, as well as being able to evaluate, is this message, about some political issue coming to me from an environmentalist group or an oil industry, and do I trust which one of those, and taking those sorts of things into account.
I'm going to run out of time, so let me just, do Boris and Natasha, operating from the Dasha in the outskirts of Moscow, trying to corrupt American democracy through multiple social media and digital ads, do they have the same unfettered First Amendment rights that anybody else does in the United States?
No.
They don't. Why not?
Well, for a number of reasons. Constitutional rights in general are diminished at most, at the very least, and for foreign nationals not within the United States. But also it's important to note that in the democracy sphere, as noted in the Blumen opinion that was referenced earlier, we have this self-governing community. We are governing ourselves, and that is why we have a democracy and a First Amendment that allows political debate, and others do not necessarily get the right.
And therefore, we have a right to protect ourselves from Boris and Natasha.
Right.
Thank you.
Mr. Vandewalker, we've heard today the suggestion, and we've seen in at least written testimony, that Russian internet ad buys were just simply too small to be considered a nefarious foreign influence, given the actual amount of money spent on electioneering ads versus other means of Russian propaganda. Would you agree with the idea that any effort by a foreign adversary to sway our elections, regardless of whether or not those efforts have a significant impact on the outcome of an election, are troubling?
Yes, I mean, first of all, we don't know the extent, so that we haven't seen the maximum figure. But yes, any amount of, again, trying to influence American elections contrary to our self-sovereignty is problematic.
You know, Mr. Vandewalker, earlier this month, Facebook stated that about 10 million people had seen these ads. How concerning would you say those estimates are, and how does that impact the public's trust of our news media and our democratic institutions?
Right. I mean, I think it's very troubling, and again, that should not be considered an upper bound. Facebook said that that was the audience that the paid ads reached. Those same profiles produced unpaid content that reached potentially tens of millions more. We don't yet know, and that's one of the problems with not having very much disclosure in this area, is that we actually still don't know the extent of the reach, and we need more information about who's trying to sway our political opinions.
So it may have reached tens of millions of people, not just 10 million. Through the purchase of thousands of ads and the use of Russian-linked accounts or bots on various social media platforms, Russia's government was able to manipulate the Internet's open access to information to spread lies, inflammatory rhetoric, and other propaganda in the hopes of swaying voters, both in the United States and France, among other places. Multiple news reports found that on Facebook alone, there were hundreds of profiles linked to Russian agents that spread false information regarding one of the presidential candidates, as well as issues like immigration, guns, and other divisive topics. During the French elections, there were similar efforts to spread false information regarding one of their presidential candidates. Mr. Vandewalker, one final question. In your opinion, are we taking, as a body in Congress, the issue of foreign infiltration of our Internet sites seriously enough?
I think there's been a lot of discussion from our perspective at the Brennan Center. We value transparency, which is crucial in elections always, and is especially crucial now to address this foreign influence. We certainly think more action could be taken. There are bills that have been introduced that would help address this problem.
Do you anticipate that the Russians and others are going to continue these efforts in the ramp up to 2018?
Everything I've seen from the intelligence community indicates that, yes, they are.
Thank you.
You know, the FEC takes a lot of hits these days, and in certain regards it is not functioning in the way it should. But there are some things that the FEC is able to do pretty well. It collects information that's submitted by campaigns every quarter. It digests that, and it produces it in a very accessible way on its online platform, so people can go there and get information about what's happening in terms of the spending on the campaigns themselves. So do you have any reason to think that the FEC would not be able to handle the responsibility of administering what's being envisioned under the Honest Ads Act in terms of information being collected, public files being produced, that being put in a place where the public can see it easily? Isn't that a function that the FEC could undertake at this point?
Yes, as you mentioned, that's one of the things that the FEC is actually good at, and they recently revamped the public face of those disclosures, making them more searchable online, and certainly policies could be developed in cooperation with social medias of the world who are very good at putting things online, I think, to make it all feasible and usable.
Thank you. I yield back.